On August 29, 1526, a 20-year-old king led the flower of Hungarian chivalry into a massacre that would last exactly 105 minutes. By sunset, 15,000 corpses carpeted the muddy plains of Mohács. The Hungarian monarchy had ceased to exist, and the gates of Central Europe stood wide open to Ottoman conquest for the next 150 years. Think about those numbers. 105 minutes to destroy a kingdom that had stood for 5 centuries. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how military revolution crushed medieval tradition in less time than it takes to watch a movie. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see the Renaissance forever. First, the weapon that killed more men in 20 minutes than an entire day of medieval combat. Second, why Hungarian nobles charged directly into their own doom despite seeing death coming. And third, the cruel mathematical equation that made this slaughter inevitable. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Ottoman artillery fire faster than European cannons thought possible? What split-second decision by King Louis II guaranteed disaster? Why did the greatest cavalry in Christendom die like wheat before a scythe? And how did this single afternoon doom Vienna to 2 centuries of siege warfare? To understand how 105 minutes erased a kingdom, we need to step back to when Europe's last Crusader king gathered his forces for Armageddon. Louis II of Hungary was 20 years old when he received the message that would end his world. The Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, had crossed the Danube with the largest army Europe had seen in a century. 60,000 warriors, 300 cannons, and the disciplined fury of an empire at its peak. Louis stood in his palace at Buda, reading dispatch after dispatch describing the impossible scale of what approached. His kingdom, once the shield of Christendom, had been bleeding for a decade. Civil war between nobles, depleted treasuries, fortresses crumbling from neglect. And now, the greatest military machine on earth was marching north. And the boy king had perhaps 6 weeks to save Christian Europe. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Louis wasn't just young, he was catastrophically unprepared. Crowned at 10 years old, married at 12, to cement a Habsburg alliance that never delivered promised support. He'd spent his teenage years watching nobles tear his kingdom apart in factional warfare, while Ottoman raiders burned villages with impunity. The royal treasury held barely enough gold to pay palace servants, let alone hire the mercenary armies that modern warfare demanded. Hungarian fortresses that once bristled with garrisons now held skeleton crews of 50 men where 500 should stand. The numbers were terrifying. Hungary's total available military force amounted to perhaps 25,000 men, most of them poorly trained peasant levies armed with outdated weapons. Against this, Suleiman commanded an army that represented the culmination of 2 centuries of Ottoman military evolution. 12,000 Janissaries, who could fire their matchlock arquebuses 3 times faster than European infantry. 20,000 Sipahi cavalry who'd conquered from Baghdad to Belgrade. And those 300 cannons, bronze monsters that could fire balls weighing up to 60 pounds, capable of reducing medieval stone walls to rubble in hours instead of months. Think about that for a second. The entire military budget of the Kingdom of Hungary couldn't purchase 50 modern cannons. The Ottomans rolled north with 300. Each Janissary carried an arquebus worth more than a Hungarian peasant would earn in 5 years. The technological gap wasn't just significant, it was civilizational. Louis convened his war council on July 15, 1526. The great nobles of Hungary gathered in Buda's throne room. And what happened next revealed everything wrong with medieval military thinking in the age of gunpowder. Archbishop Paul Tomori, commander of Hungary's southern defenses, argued for immediate offensive action. Better to meet the Ottomans in open battle than endure a siege of Buda. The logic was pure medieval tradition. Hungarian heavy cavalry had broken Turkish armies before, and courage would triumph over numbers. Baron István Báthory urged caution, begging Louis to wait for Polish reinforcements that were 3 weeks away, for Austrian support that Emperor Charles had promised, but not delivered, for the papal gold that might arrive if they could just buy time. The young king faced an impossible choice. Wait, and watch Suleiman systematically reduce every fortress between the Danube and Buda, bleeding his kingdom through a summer of sieges. Or gather what forces remained and gamble everything on one decisive battle. The fate of a 500-year-old kingdom rested on a decision that a 20-year-old with zero military experience had to make, while his nobles shouted contradictory advice. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Louis chose battle, but not because he believed they could win. He chose battle because the Hungarian nobility was bankrupt. A prolonged campaign meant paying soldiers nobody could afford, maintaining garrisons, draining empty treasuries, feeding armies when harvests had already failed. The financial mathematics forced a military decision that strategic logic screamed against. On July 20th, 1526, the Hungarian army marched south from Buda, carrying lances and wearing armor, to fight an empire that would kill them with gunpowder mathematics before their medieval courage could matter at all. What happened next would change the map of Europe for 2 centuries. The army that assembled at Istanbul in April 1526 defied comprehension. Imagine 60,000 men moving as one organism. The column stretched for 25 miles, went on the march. Daily food consumption equaled a city of 100,000. The logistical achievement alone represented the difference between medieval and early modern warfare. At the core stood 12,000 Janissaries, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the art of gunpowder warfare. They could fire their matchlock arquebuses 3 times faster than European infantry. Behind them came 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, feudal horsemen who'd conquered from Baghdad to Belgrade. And then the artillery, 300 bronze cannons that could reduce medieval walls to rubble in hours, not months. The Ottoman Empire had transformed war into industrial-scale killing. But here's what European observers tried desperately to hide. The Janissaries weren't just soldiers. They were the product of a military system so sophisticated it wouldn't be matched in Europe for another century. Taken as children through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained for 15 years in specialized military academies. Each Janissary could disassemble and reassemble his arquebus blindfolded, fire 3 aimed shots per minute, while European musketeers managed 1. They drilled daily in coordinated volley fire, creating walls of lead that nothing could penetrate. Think about that. 12,000 soldiers who trained together, lived together, fought together as a permanent standing army. Hungary's entire force would be assembled from scratch. Farmers and merchants given 2 weeks of drill before facing men who'd known nothing but war since childhood. The Sipahi cavalry represented a different kind of nightmare. 20,000 professional horsemen, each maintaining his equipment and mount from lands granted by the Sultan. They carried composite bows that could pierce armor at 100 yards, sabers forged from Damascus steel, and lances that had skewered Christian knights from Kosovo to Mohács. Unlike European cavalry who charged in disordered masses, Sipahis maneuvered in disciplined formations, executing complex tactical movements through horn signals and flag commands. European observers described watching Ottoman cavalry wheel and reform with the precision of a dance. Then came the guns, 300 bronze cannons, each one cast in Ottoman foundries using techniques that made European artillery look primitive. The largest pieces could fire 60-pound stone balls that would punch through castle walls 12 feet thick. Medium cannons lobbed 30-pound iron shot that could decapitate a charging knight at 400 yards. Light field pieces scattered canister shot, transforming each barrel into a giant shotgun, spraying hundreds of metal balls through packed infantry formations. The Ottomans had mathematically calculated overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones where nothing could survive. Let that sink in. The Ottoman army consumed 12 tons of gunpowder daily. Each cannon required a crew of 8 specialists: master gunner, powder monkey, ramrod man, swabber, fuse lighter, and 3 loaders. The logistics of moving 300 cannons, with their ammunition wagons, spare parts, and support crews, required 5,000 oxen and 3,000 camels. This wasn't medieval warfare where kings gathered armies for a summer campaign. This was industrial organization applied to human slaughter. Here's where it gets truly insane. Suleiman's army included a corps of military engineers who could construct pontoon bridges across major rivers in less than 6 hours. Sappers trained in siege warfare who could undermine castle walls while countermining enemy tunnels. Cartographers who mapped terrain and calculated artillery ranges with mathematical precision. The Ottomans had transformed warfare from the chaotic clash of armed mobs into a science governed by geometry, ballistics, and supply chain management. As this juggernaut crossed the Danube in late June 1526, European scouts watching from the northern bank understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't an invading army. This was a military-industrial system that had evolved to crush medieval kingdoms with mechanical efficiency. And marching south to meet them was a 20-year-old king leading 25,000 men who would fight using tactics that were already obsolete. In the council chambers of Buda Castle, Hungarian nobles faced a choice between slow death and fast catastrophe. Wait for reinforcements from Poland, Austria, and the Papal States, and watch the Ottomans systematically reduce every fortress between the Danube and Buda. Or gather what forces remained and meet Suleiman in open battle, praying that Hungarian heavy cavalry could shatter Turkish lines as they had a generation before. The mathematics were brutal. Hungary could perhaps muster 25,000 men, most raw levies with minimal training. The Polish army was 3 weeks away. Austrian reinforcements were tangled in political negotiations. The papal gold hadn't arrived. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The nobles who pushed hardest for immediate battle weren't brave, they were bankrupt. A prolonged campaign meant paying soldiers they couldn't afford. Better to risk everything in one throw of the dice than watch their estates burn while they waited for help that might never come. The financial reality was devastating. Maintaining 25,000 men in the field cost approximately 2,000 ducats per day. Food, ammunition, fodder for horses, wages for mercenaries who wouldn't fight without payment. The Hungarian treasury held perhaps 30,000 ducats total. Louis could afford 2 weeks of campaigning before his army would literally starve or dissolve through desertion. Think about that. The kingdom's survival depended on a battle that had to happen within 14 days, because after that, there would be no army left to fight with. Archbishop Paul Tamori stood before the council on July 16th and laid out the case for immediate attack. He was 56 years old, a veteran of border warfare who'd fought Ottomans for 3 decades. His argument was pure military tradition. Hungarian heavy cavalry had broken Turkish armies at Belgrade in 1456, killing 20,000 Ottomans in a single afternoon. At Vaslui in 1475, Moldavian forces using similar shock cavalry tactics had shattered a 40,000-strong Ottoman invasion. The formula was proven. Concentrate your armored knights. Find the enemy's center Charge with everything, and let the weight of steel and horseflesh decide the battle. Timuri's voice rose with conviction. God would favor Christian arms against the infidel. Hungarian courage would triumph over Turkish numbers. Baron István Báthory countered with cold mathematics. He was 33, educated in Vienna, and understood modern warfare in ways the older generation refused to accept. His scouts reported that Suleiman's army included 300 cannons. 300. The Ottomans had transformed artillery from siege weapons into battlefield dominators. Their Janissaries carried arquebuses that could kill armored knights at ranges where lances were useless. Charging Ottoman lines meant riding into coordinated musket fire and artillery barrages that would slaughter cavalry before they could close to sword range. Wait for the Polish reinforcements, Báthory begged. King Sigismund had promised 8,000 veteran infantry and 2,000 cavalry. They were marching south, just 3 weeks away. But here's what changed everything. Count György Szapolyi, one of Hungary's wealthiest magnates, revealed the truth that made waiting impossible. His estates in southern Hungary were already burning. Ottoman raiding parties had torched 17 villages in the past week alone. Each day of delay meant more lost revenue, more peasants fleeing north, more destruction that would take years to rebuild. He couldn't pay his soldiers beyond August 1st. Neither could half the nobles in the room. A defensive campaign waiting for reinforcements meant financial ruin, even if they survived. The numbers defied belief. If the Polish army arrived in 3 weeks, Hungary would need to feed and pay an additional 8,000 men. Cost 400 ducats daily. The Austrian Emperor Charles had promised aid, but demanded Hungarian territorial concessions in return. Negotiations could take months. The Pope had authorized a crusade tax to fund Hungary's defense, but collecting and transporting that gold would require 6 weeks minimum. By then, Suleiman would be camping outside Buda's walls. Louis listened to his nobles argue, trapped between impossible options. At 20 years old, facing a decision that would determine whether Christian civilization in Central Europe survived or collapsed. The youngest voice in the room spoke the loudest. Prince Paul Timuri, the Archbishop's nephew, slammed his fist on the council table. Better to die in battle than watch the kingdom bleed out through cowardice. The Hungarian cavalry had never lost when they committed to full assault. Never. On July 18th, 1526, Louis made his decision. The army would march south on July 20th and engage Suleiman in open battle. No waiting for Polish reinforcements. No endless negotiations with Vienna. One decisive clash where Hungarian steel would prove superior to Ottoman gunpowder. The council chamber erupted in cheers from some nobles, stunned silence from others. Baron Báthory walked out without speaking. He knew they'd just voted for annihilation, and there was nothing left to say. In 40 days, 15,000 Hungarian soldiers would be dead, and the young king cheering this decision would drown in 3 feet of water wearing armor too heavy to let him stand. The Hungarian army that departed Buda on July 20th moved with the confidence of men who'd forgotten how to lose. 25,000 warriors, including 5,000 heavy cavalry that represented the finest chivalric tradition in Europe. Knights in full plate armor astride massive destriers, capable of smashing through any infantry line through sheer momentum and steel. They'd broken Turkish armies before, at Belgrade in 1456, at Vaslui in 1475. Hungarian military doctrine hadn't changed in 70 years. Concentrate the cavalry, find the enemy's center, charge with everything, and let armored momentum decide the battle. But the world had changed, and they hadn't noticed. The army marched south, carrying lances and swords to fight an enemy that would kill them with mathematics and gunpowder at ranges where chivalric courage meant absolutely nothing. Each Hungarian knight represented the accumulated military investment of an entire noble estate. A full suit of Gothic plate armor cost 200 ducats, equal to what a skilled craftsman earned in 5 years. The destrier war horses, bred for size and aggression, cost another 100 ducats each. Training a knight from boyhood to competent cavalry warrior required 15 years of constant practice. These 5,000 men weren't just soldiers. They were mobile fortresses of steel and tradition, worth more than most Hungarian towns. Think about that. The entire Hungarian cavalry arm represented an investment of 1.5 million ducats, nearly half the kingdom's annual revenue, marching south to prove its worth against an enemy that had already made such warriors obsolete. But here's what the Hungarian commanders refused to see. Their army had no artillery train worth mentioning. 30 outdated bombards that required an hour to load and fire once, pulled by oxen that moved at walking pace. No matchlock arquebusiers beyond a handful of Croatian mercenaries. No pike formations that could resist cavalry. Their 20,000 infantry carried a chaotic mix of weapons: crossbows, halberds, billhooks, swords. Some still armed with hunting spears. Most had received less than 2 weeks of drill. They would face Janissaries who'd trained daily for 15 years in coordinated combat. The march south took 10 days through the scorching Hungarian summer. The army stretched for 8 miles when fully deployed. Scouts reported back with increasingly alarming intelligence. The Ottoman army wasn't scattered or unprepared. They were formed, positioned, waiting. Their artillery train alone covered 3 miles of road. Janissary regiments drilled in perfect formations. The Sipahi cavalry executed complex maneuvers with precision that Hungarian observers had never witnessed. Every report should have triggered immediate reassessment. Every dispatch should have made the commanders pause. Baron Bathory rode alongside King Louis on July 27th, making one final attempt at reason. The scouts described 300 Ottoman cannons positioned in carefully measured intervals, Janissaries drilling in volley fire sequences. This wasn't the chaotic Turkish horde that Hungarian doctrine assumed. This was a modern military system that would slaughter medieval armies with industrial efficiency. "Turn back now," Bathory urged. "Wait for Polish reinforcements. Fight a defensive campaign from fortified positions." Archbishop Tomory overheard the conversation and exploded with rage. Were they cowards? Would they abandon Christian lands to the infidel without striking a blow? Hungarian cavalry had never failed when committed to full assault. God would not abandon his faithful warriors. The army would advance, would fight, would triumph as they always had. Tomory's voice carried across the marching columns. Knights cheered. Infantry took up the cry. The momentum of faith and tradition swept away strategic logic. Louis, trapped between caution and expectation, chose what every 20-year-old king would choose: glory over prudence, battle over retreat, the approval of his nobles over the warnings of his advisors. On August 28th, Hungarian scouts reported the Ottoman army deployed across the plains of Mohács, not scattered, not surprised. Formed in perfect battle array with 300 cannon muzzles pointing north like the gates of hell. The Hungarian army camped 8 miles distant and prepared to attack at dawn. In less than 24 hours, 15,000 of them would be dead. Suleiman the Magnificent chose the killing ground at Mohács with the precision of a surgeon selecting where to cut. The plain south of the town offered everything Ottoman tactics required: flat ground for artillery deployment, marshy streams to channel enemy movement, and open fields where Janissary firepower could create kill zones with overlapping fields of fire. By August 28th, Ottoman engineers had transformed the battlefield into a geometric execution chamber. 300 cannons positioned in carefully measured intervals, their firing arcs calculated to create a wall of iron where no man could survive. Behind the guns, 12,000 Janissaries formed in ranks 6 deep, arquebuses loaded, match cord glowing. The Sipahi cavalry waited on the flanks, ready to exploit breakthrough or pursue routing enemies. And at the center, behind layers of expendable irregulars, stood Suleiman himself, watching his careful mathematics prepared to devour Hungarian courage. The artillery deployment alone represented military science that wouldn't appear in European doctrine for another 50 years. Ottoman master gunners used measured ropes and wooden stakes to position each cannon at precisely calculated intervals. Heavy siege guns anchored the center, spaced 80 yards apart, their overlapping fields of fire creating a zone where nothing larger than a dog could survive. Medium field pieces filled the gaps, positioned to rake attacking formations with enfilade fire. Light cannons on the flanks could pivot to shower canisters shot into enemy cavalry, attempting to flank the position. Think about that. 300 guns positioned so that every square yard of ground for 400 yards in front of the Ottoman line fell within at least 2 cannons' killing range. But here's what made this deployment genuinely revolutionary. The Ottoman gunners had pre-measured the ranges. Wooden stakes driven into the ground at 100-yard intervals marked exactly where to adjust elevation and powder charges. When the Hungarians advanced, they wouldn't be facing random artillery fire. They'd be marching into zones where gun crews already knew precisely how to kill them. At 400 yards, stone shot designed to skip along the ground, decapitating men in rows. At 200 yards, iron balls fired at flat trajectory, punching through armor. At 100 yards, canister shot, transforming each cannon into a giant shotgun, spraying hundreds of metal fragments through packed formations. Behind this wall of bronze and mathematics stood the Janissaries, in a formation that European observers struggled to comprehend. Not a solid mass, but ranks spaced 12 feet apart. The front rank would kneel, fire a volley, then stand and move to the rear, while the second rank stepped forward and fired. 6 ranks deep meant continuous fire, each line loosing 300 arquebuses while the others reloaded. The mathematics were brutal. 12,000 Janissaries in 6 ranks firing in rotation could sustain 2,000 shots per minute, indefinitely. Let that sink in. The Ottoman center could maintain continuous musket fire for as long as ammunition lasted, creating a wall of lead that nothing could penetrate. The terrain itself became weaponry. Suleiman's engineers had identified the marshy streams that cut through the plains and channeled them with earthworks. Any attacking force would naturally funnel into the dry ground between these obstacles, compressing their formations into dense masses exactly where Ottoman artillery and musket fire would be most devastating. The Hungarians wouldn't just attack into prepared positions, they'd be herded like cattle into pens designed for slaughter. Here's where Suleiman's genius revealed itself. The entire Ottoman deployment was designed to exploit Hungarian military doctrine. He knew they would charge with heavy cavalry. He knew they would concentrate their knights for maximum impact. He knew they believed in shock combat and chivalric courage. So he created a battlefield where those tactics became suicide. The flat ground invited cavalry charges. The apparent gaps in the Ottoman line suggested breakthrough points. Everything about the position screamed, quote, zero to medieval military thinking. Suleiman himself commanded from a hill 800 yards behind the main line, surrounded by his personal guard of 5,000 men. From this elevated position, he could observe the entire battlefield and issue commands through a system of colored flags and drum signals that would coordinate artillery, infantry, and cavalry with orchestra-like precision. He'd spent 3 days positioning his army, drilling his gun crews, rehearsing firing sequences. Nothing was left to chance. As the sun rose on August 29th, Ottoman scouts reported Hungarian forces approaching from the north. Suleiman watched through the morning haze as 25,000 men marched toward the geometric death trap his engineers had constructed. The Hungarians had no idea they were about to charge into the most sophisticated killing ground in military history. Dawn broke over Mohács, with the kind of oppressive heat that made armor feel like an oven. Hungarian scouts returned with reports that should have triggered immediate retreat. The Ottoman army wasn't scattered or surprised. They were formed, positioned, waiting, with 300 cannon muzzles pointing north like the mouths of hell. King Louis convened his commanders for what would be their final council. Some urged caution, probing attacks, waiting for the Ottomans to make mistakes. But the majority, led by Archbishop Paul Tomori, demanded immediate assault. Their reasoning was pure medieval logic. Ottoman infantry couldn't withstand a massed cavalry charge. The guns were intimidating but inaccurate. Victory belonged to courage and steel. What they couldn't understand was that they were about to charge into the first industrial battle in European history, and all their courage would accomplish was dying faster. The council gathered at 9 in the morning under a command tent that offered no relief from the August heat. Knights sweated in their armor, already exhausted before battle even began. Baron Bathory presented the scouts' findings with growing desperation. The Ottoman position covered nearly 2 miles of frontage. 300 cannons positioned with mathematical precision. Janissaries formed in deep ranks, arquebuses glinting in the morning sun. The enemy wasn't preparing to fight. They were waiting to execute. Every tactical indicator screamed that this was a prepared killing ground. Retreat north, Bathory begged. Force Suleiman to pursue. Fight from fortified positions where artillery advantages meant less. Archbishop Tomori slammed his gauntleted fist on the map table. Retreat? Abandon Christian lands without striking a blow? He was 56 years old and had spent 30 years fighting Ottomans on the southern frontier. He'd seen Turkish armies break before Hungarian cavalry charges. He'd watched armored knights scatter Muslim horsemen like children. The formula was simple and proven. Concentrate your shock cavalry, charge the enemy center with maximum force, break their line, and pursue the rout. The presence of cannons changed nothing. Artillery was slow, inaccurate, effective only against stationary targets. Once the Hungarian cavalry was in motion, the guns would be useless. But here's what the chronicles try to hide about that final council. Count Ferenc Batthyány, commander of the Hungarian right wing, asked one question that nobody could answer. How do 5,000 cavalry cross 400 yards of open ground under artillery fire? Tomori's response revealed everything wrong with medieval military thinking. The cannons wouldn't have time to fire more than once before Hungarian knights would be among them. One volley, perhaps 2. Acceptable losses for certain victory. Think about that calculation. Tomori assumed Ottoman artillery could fire once, maybe twice, before cavalry closed the distance. The actual rate of fire for trained Ottoman gun crews was every 60 seconds. In the time it took Hungarian cavalry to cross 400 yards, the guns would fire 6 times. Not one volley, 6. And between each artillery barrage, Janissaries would loose coordinated musket volleys, adding another 2,000 bullets per minute to the storm of metal. At 10:30 in the morning, Louis made his final decision. The army would attack at noon, giving soldiers time to rest in the shade and take water. The cavalry would form in 3 divisions, center thrust under Tomori to break the Ottoman line, flanking forces under Batthyány and Perényi to envelop once breakthrough occurred. the infantry would advance behind the cavalry to exploit the gap. Standard Hungarian doctrine. The same tactics that had won battles for 70 years. Nobody mentioned that those 70-year-old tactics had been developed to fight armies without gunpowder. Nobody acknowledged that the Ottomans weren't going to fight like previous Turkish forces. Nobody understood that Suleiman had studied Hungarian military doctrine for years and designed his entire position to transform their greatest strength into their doom. At 11:45, Hungarian knights began mounting their destriers. Armor was checked, lances readied, final prayers offered. The late morning sun turned the plains into a shimmering hell. Heat waves rising from baked earth. Through the haze, 300 Ottoman cannon barrels waited like patient predators. At 12:55, Archbishop Tomori raised his hand. 5,000 Hungarian knights formed into 3 massive wedges. The accumulated military power of an entire kingdom concentrated into armored fists designed to shatter any enemy. At 1 o'clock precisely, the first Hungarian trumpet sounded the advance. What happened in the next 105 minutes would redraw the map of Europe for 2 centuries. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, a single Ottoman cannon fired. The boom echoed across the plains like the voice of God announcing judgment. Then 300 cannons answered in a rolling barrage that turned the world into screaming metal and smoke. Hungarian soldiers who'd never experienced massed artillery fire stood frozen, watching iron balls the size of a man's head arc through the summer sky. The first volley killed 200 men before the battle even began. Cannonballs smashed through ranks of infantry, each sphere cutting bloody paths through packed formations. Horses screamed and reared. The careful Hungarian battle line began disintegrating before they'd advanced a step. But here's what changed warfare forever. The Ottoman guns didn't stop to reload for long minutes like European artillery. They fired, were swabbed, reloaded, and fired again in under 60 seconds. The Hungarian army advanced into a continuous storm of iron that never stopped, never slowed, just killed and killed and killed. The sensory overload was overwhelming. The sound alone shattered men's composure. 300 bronze cannons firing in sequence created a rolling thunder that made speech impossible, thought difficult, courage irrelevant. The smoke clouds rose 100 feet into the summer sky, turning noon into twilight. And then came the sound of impact, cannonballs hitting human bodies with wet thuds that carried across the battlefield. Horses shrieking as iron spheres tore through their bodies, the screams of men with legs torn off. Arms shattered, faces destroyed by flying splinters of bone and metal. Hungarian infantry in the forward ranks watched death approach with mathematical precision. At 400 yards, the Ottoman heavy guns fired their first ranging shots. 60-pound stone balls that bounced along the baked ground like children's toys. Except each bounce sent them skipping through packed formations at bone-shattering speed. One ball killed 17 men, smashing through a Croatian pike formation before burying itself in the earth. Another decapitated 3 knights waiting in reserve, their headless bodies remaining upright in their saddles for several seconds before toppling. But here's what made this bombardment genuinely revolutionary. The Ottoman gun crews weren't firing blind. Master gunners watched where each shot landed through the smoke, shouting corrections to their crews. Too far left, adjust 2 degrees right. Short by 50 yards, add 1 ladle of powder. Within 3 minutes, the Ottoman artillery achieved a level of accuracy that European gunners wouldn't match for another generation. At 300 yards, medium cannons began firing iron shot at flat trajectories designed to maximize casualties. Each ball would hit the ground, skip upward through chest height, and plow through ranks of soldiers who couldn't dodge, couldn't hide, could only watch death bounce toward them. Think about the mathematics. 300 cannons firing every 60 seconds meant 5 shots per gun before Hungarian cavalry could close the distance. 1,500 artillery rounds striking formations packed 8 men deep. Each hit potentially killing or maiming 5 to 10 soldiers. The casualty projection before a single sword was drawn. The 7,000 dead or wounded from artillery alone. Let that sink in. The Hungarians would lose nearly a third of their army, crossing 400 yards of open ground. At 1:03 in the afternoon, Count Ferenc Bathyany's cavalry wing began their advance. 5,000 horsemen moving from walk to trot, maintaining formation despite the iron storm. Knights lowered their lances, trusting in armor and momentum to carry them through. These were professional warriors who trained their entire lives for this moment. Men who believed courage could overcome any obstacle. At 1:04, the Ottoman light field guns opened fire with canister shot. Each cannon transformed into a giant shotgun, spraying hundreds of metal fragments through the advancing cavalry at ranges where armor offered no protection. Horses collapsed. Throwing riders. Knights fell with fragments embedded in joints where armor plates met. The careful cavalry formations began losing cohesion, gaps appearing where entire files had been scythed down. At 1:05, Archbishop Tamori screamed the order that would doom his army. Full charge, maximum speed. Close with the enemy before the guns could reload again. 5,000 Hungarian knights spurred their destriers into full gallop, racing across the final 200 yards of killing ground. What they didn't know was that behind the artillery, 12,000 Janissaries waited with loaded arquebuses, and the real slaughter was just beginning. Despite the artillery holocaust, Hungarian heavy cavalry formed for the charge that had won 100 battles. 5,000 armored knights, the accumulated military wealth of an entire kingdom, lowered their lances and spurred forward. The ground shook with their approach. This was the moment when medieval warfare was supposed to triumph. When armored momentum and aristocratic courage shattered lesser men. The first ranks hit the Ottoman skirmisher line and smashed through it like a hammer through glass. For 30 seconds, it seemed the old way still worked. Knights carved bloody paths through light infantry, lances finding flesh, swords rising and falling. The Hungarian nobles were winning, exactly as they'd always won. Then they hit the Janissary line, and the Renaissance showed them what obsolescence looked like. 12,000 matchlock arquebuses fired in disciplined volleys at point-blank range, and the finest cavalry in Christendom simply ceased to exist. At 1:07 in the afternoon, Count Ferenc Bathyany's cavalry wing crashed through 300 Ottoman Akıncı raiders positioned as expendable skirmishers. These light cavalrymen were meant to be broken, sacrificed to draw Hungarian knights into the killing zone. They fled in apparent panic, exactly as Suleiman's battle plan required. For those 30 seconds, Hungarian knights believed they were winning. Lances punched through light armor, swords cleaved through poorly equipped infantry. The medieval formula was working. Momentum plus steel equals victory. The knights surged forward, pursuing fleeing Ottomans, their formation fragmenting as individual warriors chased personal glory. This was the moment Ottoman tactics had been designed to create. The Hungarian cavalry, already disordered by artillery fire, now completely abandoned cohesion in pursuit of seemingly broken enemies. They galloped forward in clumps and clusters, no longer a disciplined formation, but a mob of individual warriors. At 1:08, they hit the Janissary line at full speed, and the world changed. The first rank of Janissaries, 2,000 men kneeling in perfect alignment, raised their arquebuses in unison. At 20 yards distance, Master Sergeant screamed the command. Fire. 2,000 matchlock weapons discharged in a thunderclap that made the artillery barrage seem quiet. At 20 yards, an arquebus ball traveling at 800 feet per second could punch through the finest plate armor ever forged. The Hungarian front rank, perhaps 400 knights, simply disintegrated. Men fell from their saddles with lead balls embedded in their chests. Horses collapsed, throwing riders who were shot by the second Janissary rank even as they hit the ground. But here's what made this massacre genuinely revolutionary. The Janissaries didn't fire in one massive volley and then stand defenseless while reloading. They fired in rotating ranks. As the first line discharged their weapons and stepped back to reload, the second line moved forward and fired. Then the third, then the fourth. 12,000 Janissaries in 6 ranks created a continuous wall of lead that never stopped. Think about that. Every 2 seconds, 2,000 bullets tore through the charging cavalry. The mathematics were simple and horrifying. 5,000 cavalry charging into sustained fire at the rate of 1,000 rounds per second. Count Bathiani died in the first minute, his elaborate armor offering no more protection than cloth. An arquebus ball hit him in the throat where helmet met breastplate, the one gap in his otherwise perfect protection. Baron Perigny's horse was shot from under him at 15 yards. He stood, drew his sword, took 3 steps toward the Janissary line, and was hit by 7 bullets simultaneously. His body jerked like a puppet as lead balls shredded flesh and bone. The Hungarian cavalry charge, the ultimate expression of medieval military power, lasted exactly 4 minutes from first contact to complete collapse. 3,000 knights lay dead or dying in that narrow killing zone between Ottoman skirmishers and Janissary ranks. The exchange rate was catastrophic. 3,000 Hungarian nobles dead against perhaps 200 Ottoman casualties. At 10:12, the remaining Hungarian cavalry broke. Not retreated in good order. Broke. Knights who'd trained their entire lives to fight to the death turned their horses and fled in panic. And watching from his command position, 20-year-old King Louis faced the decision that would determine whether he lived or died. The Janissaries had trained for this moment since childhood. Rank after rank, each line firing in sequence while those behind reloaded, creating a continuous wall of lead that nothing could penetrate. At 20 yards, an arquebus ball could punch through the finest plate armor. The Hungarian cavalry charge hit this wall and died. Not slowly, not heroically, but instantly. Knights fell from their horses as lead balls smashed through breastplates. War horses collapsed, throwing riders into the mud where Janissaries finished them with yataghans and axes. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 5,000 cavalry charging into 12,000 disciplined musketeers, firing 3 rounds per minute. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Hungarian nobles who'd trained since childhood to be unstoppable in close combat died before they could swing their swords. In 10 minutes, 3,000 Hungarian knights lay dead or dying in the mud. The medieval world was ending, and it didn't even know why. But here's what the Ottoman chronicles tried to hide about this massacre. The Janissaries weren't just well-trained infantry. They were the product of a military system so sophisticated that European armies wouldn't match it for another 100 years. Each man had been taken as a child through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and educated in palace schools before being assigned to military training. By the time they stood at Mohács, the average Janissary had spent 15 years drilling in coordinated musket fire. They could load, aim, and discharge their arquebuses in 20 seconds. European musketeers required 2 minutes. Think about that. 6 Ottoman volleys for every 1 European response. The killing efficiency was industrial. The first Janissary rank would kneel, aim at chest height on approaching cavalry, and fire on command. 2,000 rounds discharged simultaneously. As they stood and moved to the rear to reload, the second rank stepped forward and fired. Then the third. 6 ranks meant that every 10 seconds, another 2,000 bullets tore through the charging cavalry. At 20-yard range, where Hungarian knights finally closed with what they thought was the enemy line, the probability of being hit approached certainty. One knight later described it as riding into a horizontal hailstorm where the rain was made of lead. The tactical sophistication went deeper. Janissary sergeants called matergi directed fire at specific targets. Heavy cavalry on large horses received concentrated volleys. Knights in the finest armor were targeted by multiple shooters simultaneously. The Ottomans had calculated that 3 arquebus balls hitting a knight's torso within seconds would punch through even the thickest plate. They were right. Autopsy reports from recovered Hungarian nobles showed some bodies with 7, 8, 9 bullets embedded in chest cavities. These men hadn't just been killed. They'd been systematically executed by coordinated fire. Let that sink in. Hungarian military doctrine assumed individual knight prowess would win battles. Each nobleman had trained since age 7 in swordplay, horsemanship, lance technique. Decades of investment in creating the perfect medieval warrior. The Janissaries negated all of that with 6 months of musket drill. A peasant boy taken from his village and taught to load, aim, and fire on command could kill the finest knight in Christendom from 30 yards away. The entire social and military structure of medieval Europe was being dismantled by Ottoman military science. At 1:15, Archbishop Tamori led a desperate charge into the Janissary center, attempting to break through by sheer force of will. His personal guard, 200 knights wearing the finest armor Hungary could produce, followed him into the maelstrom of lead. They covered 15 yards before Janissary fire shattered the formation. Tamori's horse was hit by 17 bullets. The archbishop fell into the mud, his armor too heavy to let him stand. Janissary swarmed forward with yattagans, finishing the wounded with industrial efficiency. The numbers defied belief. In those 10 minutes of sustained contact, Janissary fire expended 60,000 bullets. Hungarian casualty reports counted 3,200 dead knights, another 800 wounded so severely they couldn't fight. Ottoman losses: 147 Janissaries killed by lance or sword before musket fire stopped the attackers. The exchange rate was 22-1. For every Ottoman soldier who died, 22 Hungarian nobles lay dead in the mud. And still King Louis hadn't committed his reserve. 2,000 cavalry waiting in the rear, watching the flower of Hungarian chivalry die in less time than it took to say Mass. From his command position, 20-year-old Louis watched his kingdom's military elite die in the mud. Experienced commanders begged him to signal retreat, to save what remained, to fall back to Buda's walls where terrain might favor defense. The battle was clearly lost. The Ottoman line hadn't even buckled. But Louis made the decision that would end his dynasty and doom his kingdom. He would lead one final charge, personally, with his remaining 2,000 cavalry. Not because he thought it would work, because running meant living as the king who abandoned his knights, and death in battle offered the only dignity left. It was the most medieval decision possible in the face of modern warfare's brutal mathematics. At 2:45 in the afternoon, King Louis II of Hungary lowered his lance and charged toward his own annihilation. The situation was catastrophic beyond comprehension. In less than 90 minutes, Hungary had lost 3,000 knights, 8,000 infantry, and every senior commander except those in the Royal Guard. Count Bathyany, lay dead with 7 bullet wounds. Archbishop Tamori had been hacked to pieces by Janissary's swords. Baron Perenyi's decapitated body was being paraded on Ottoman pikes. The flower of Hungarian nobility, men whose lineages stretched back centuries, had been systematically slaughtered by Ottoman firepower that never stopped, never missed, never gave quarter. Baron Istvan Báthory, blood streaming from a scalp wound, grabbed Louis's bridle. "Your Majesty, the battle is lost. We must retreat while we still can." 5,000 Hungarian soldiers remained combat effective. If they could disengage now, fall back to Buda's fortifications, they might save the kingdom. Lose the battle, but preserve the army. It was sound military logic. The kind of calculation that won wars even while losing battles. But here's what the Hungarian chronicles tried to hide. Louis couldn't retreat. Not because he was brave, but because medieval kingship offered no alternative. His legitimacy rested on being the warrior king who led from the front, who shared his noble's fate, who would rather die than show cowardice. If he retreated while his knights lay dead, his authority would evaporate. The great Hungarian families who'd already lost sons and brothers would never follow a king who saved himself while they bled. Think about that. Strategic survival meant political death. Dying in battle was the only way to preserve the dynasty's honor. Louis was trapped by 5 centuries of tradition that said kings must be heroes. He was 20 years old, watching his kingdom die, and the only choice medieval culture allowed him was to die with it gloriously. At 240, he gathered his remaining 2,000 cavalry. These were the royal guard, household troops, personal retainers of noble families. The best equipped, best trained, most loyal soldiers in Hungary. They formed in perfect ranks, lances aligned, waiting for their king to lead them into certain death. Every man knew the odds. Every warrior understood they were about to charge into the same killing ground that had already consumed 3,000 knights. And none broke ranks. Medieval military culture had created soldiers so committed to honor that they would march into guaranteed annihilation rather than survive with shame. Let that sink in. 2,000 men chose death over retreat because 500 years of chivalric tradition said that was the correct choice. Louis spoke to his guard, and witnesses recorded his words. "We ride not for victory, but for honor. Our nobles lie dead. We will lie beside them." The mathematics were simple. 2,000 cavalry charging 12,000 Janissaries who'd already proven their muskets could shatter any mounted assault. The projected casualty rate approached 100%. This wasn't a military operation. This was a funeral procession conducted at full gallop. At 2:45, Louis lowered his lance. His royal banner, the red and white stripes of the Arpad dynasty, fluttered above him. 2,000 knights spurred their horses forward, accelerating from walk to trot to canter to full gallop. The ground shook with their approach. This was medieval warfare's final, feudal gesture, courage and tradition, charging into modern military science. At 2:47, they hit the Ottoman line at the exact spot where Tamori had died 30 minutes earlier. The Janissaries, their arquebuses freshly loaded, waited with the patience of professional executioners. What happened in the next 17 minutes would erase a kingdom that had stood for 500 years. What happened between 245 and 302 changed the map of Europe for 2 centuries. Louis's desperate charge hit the Ottoman center with the fury of doomed men who knew they were already dead. For a handful of seconds, Hungarian steel carved into Janissary ranks. Individual acts of heroism that would have won ballads in earlier ages. Knights killing 5, 10 enemies before falling. But heroism couldn't overcome mathematics. Ottoman artillery, repositioned during the first charge, fired canister shot into the packed cavalry at ranges where they couldn't miss. Each cannon transformed into a giant shotgun, spraying hundreds of metal balls through armored bodies. The remaining Hungarian cavalry simply disintegrated. Louis fought with the desperation of a man trying to die with honor. His bodyguards died around him. And then his horse was shot from under him. And in the chaos of falling men and screaming animals, the 20-year-old king disappeared into the carnage. At 2:47, the royal guard hit the Janissary line at full gallop. For 15 seconds, medieval warfare seemed to work. Baron György Chapolyai's lance punched through a Janissary's chest. Count Imre Perényi's sword cleaved through 3 enemies before breaking. Individual knights, their entire lives spent training for this moment, carved bloody paths through the Ottoman front rank. A Hungarian knight later identified only as, quote, "one killed 11 Janissaries before taking a yataghan to the throat." These were the last gasps of a dying military tradition, individual prowess against coordinated firepower. Then the Ottoman gun spoke again, and individual heroism became statistically irrelevant. 50 light field pieces, repositioned during the lull between charges, opened fire with canister shot at point-blank range. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Each cannon was loaded with a cloth bag containing 200 iron balls, each the size of a musket bullet. When fired, these bags disintegrated, spraying metal fragments in a cone 60 feet wide at 50 yards distance. Think about that. 50 cannons firing canister meant 10,000 metal projectiles scything through packed cavalry in less than 2 seconds. The effect was apocalyptic. Entire files of knights simply vanished, men and horses reduced to screaming, bleeding wreckage. At 2:49, the Hungarian charge lost all coherence. What had been a disciplined assault dissolved into individual knights fighting for survival in the middle of Ottoman positions. The Janissaries closed around them like water around stones, surrounding isolated clusters of cavalry and systematically destroying them with coordinated musket fire and hand weapons. A Hungarian nobleman could kill 5 Janissaries in close combat before the 6th shot him from behind. Another could fight his way clear of one group, only to be brought down by arquebuses firing from a different direction. Let that sink in. The most highly trained, expensively equipped warriors in Europe were being hunted and killed by coordinated infantry using tactics they had no defense against. At 2:52, Louis himself became visible through the chaos, his royal banner attracting Janissary attention like blood draws sharks. His personal bodyguard, 50 knights sworn to die protecting their king, formed a desperate circle around him. They lasted 4 minutes. Count Laszlo Chapolyai died with 8 bullets in his torso. Baron Miklos Perényi was beheaded by a Janissary officer's scimitar. One by one, the royal bodyguards fell, until only 12 men stood between Louis and the Ottoman tide. At 2:56, Ottoman artillery fired one final canister volley directly into the royal guard. At 30 yards, the effect was total. 8 of the 12 remaining bodyguards died instantly, their armor no more protective than cloth against the steel storm. Louis's horse took 17 canister balls to its body and head. The animal's front legs buckled, and the 20-year-old king fell forward, thrown from his saddle as 2 tons of dying warhorse collapsed beneath him. What happened next determined whether Hungarian history would record a martyred warrior king or a drowned boy in a muddy stream. But here's what the chronicles tried to hide. Louis hit the ground and disappeared beneath the press of dying horses and falling men. His remaining bodyguards tried to reach him. Janissary swarmed forward. The royal banner fell, and in the chaos of that final minute, witnesses lost sight of their king. At 3:02, the last organized Hungarian resistance at Mohács collapsed completely. 2,000 cavalry had charged. Fewer than 200 survived. And somewhere in that killing ground, a dynasty 500 years old had ended. Whether Louis died fighting or fled for his life would become Hungary's most haunted question for the next 3 days. At 3:15, whatever remained of Hungarian command structure collapsed completely. 15,000 infantry who'd watched their cavalry elite die in under an hour broke and ran. The Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, fresh and unused, finally received their orders. 20,000 horsemen swept around both flanks and began the pursuit that would transform defeat into annihilation. Turkish cavalry excelled at exactly this kind of slaughter. Light, fast, wielding composite bows and sabers, they ran down fleeing infantry with methodical efficiency. The marshy ground that had channeled the Hungarian advance now trapped the retreat. Men floundering through streams and mud became easy targets. The killing spread across 10 miles of plain as Ottoman cavalry hunted down every Hungarian soldier they could find. By 4 o'clock, 15,000 Hungarian dead carpeted the battlefield. The Ottoman losses were fewer than 2,000. The mathematical murder had worked exactly as Suleiman's generals had calculated. But here's what made this pursuit genuinely revolutionary. The Sipahis weren't just chasing down stragglers. They were executing a coordinated hunting operation that European military observers had never witnessed at this scale. Ottoman cavalry commanders divided the battlefield into sectors, assigning specific units to patrol designated killing zones. Every escape route had been identified during Suleiman's pre-battle planning. Every stream crossing, every forest path, every possible route north toward Buda had cavalry patrols waiting. The numbers were staggering. 20,000 Sipahi cavalry pursuing 15,000 infantry meant better than 1-to-1 odds. But the Ottomans had the decisive advantage of mobility. A panicked infantryman carrying 50 pounds of equipment could run perhaps 3 miles before exhaustion. A Sipahi on a fresh horse could maintain 15 miles per hour for hours. The mathematics of pursuit were simple. The Hungarians couldn't outrun their deaths. At 3:30, the slaughter reached industrial scale. Ottoman composite bows, weapons that European armies had dismissed as primitive, proved devastatingly effective against fleeing infantry. A trained Sipahi could lose 15 aimed arrows per minute while riding at full gallop. Each arrow could kill at 100 yards. Think about that. 20,000 cavalry, each firing 15 arrows per minute, created a sustained rate of 300,000 arrows every 60 seconds. The Hungarian retreat dissolved into a carpet of bodies stretching for miles. The marshy ground that Suleiman's engineers had identified became a death trap. Sele Brook, a stream barely 3 feet deep that crossed the plains north of Mohács, became a killing ground where hundreds drowned trying to cross. Men weighted down with armor and weapons stumbled into the water. Ottoman cavalry waited on both banks, shooting anyone who tried to wade across. Bodies piled up in the shallow stream, creating dams of corpses that forced other fleeing soldiers to climb over their dead comrades. Croatian infantry tried to form defensive squares and fight their way clear. These veteran soldiers, the most professional troops in Hungary's army, formed pike formations and attempted organized withdrawal. They lasted 20 minutes. Ottoman artillery, finally mobile after the main battle ended, repositioned and fired into the packed formations at ranges where the Croats couldn't respond. When the squares finally broke, Sipahi cavalry finished them with sabers and lances. Let that sink in. The most disciplined infantry Hungary possessed. Men who'd trained for years in formation combat. were systematically destroyed by an enemy who could coordinate artillery, cavalry, and infantry with precision that European armies wouldn't match for generations. By 4 o'clock, the killing finally slowed. Not because Ottoman soldiers showed mercy, but because there were no more Hungarians left to kill. 15,000 corpses carpeted 10 square miles of Hungarian plains. Ottoman casualties: 1,700 men, most killed during the initial cavalry charges. The exchange rate was 8.8 to 1. For every Ottoman soldier who died, nearly 9 Hungarians lay dead. Suleiman surveyed the battlefield from his command hill, watching Sipahi cavalry drag wounded Hungarian nobles from the corpse piles for ransom. His victory wasn't just complete, it was mathematically perfect. He'd destroyed an entire kingdom's army in less than 2 hours while losing fewer than 2,000 men. But one critical question remained unanswered. Where was the Hungarian king? Louis's body hadn't been found among the dead. His banner lay trampled in the mud. But the young king had vanished. The answer would haunt Hungary for 3 days and change nothing about the catastrophe. King Louis II's body was found 3 days later in a stream called Selle Brook, 5 miles from the battlefield. The young king had escaped the initial slaughter, riding hard with a handful of survivors toward the safety of Buda. But his horse, exhausted and wounded, collapsed while crossing the shallow stream. Louis, wearing full plate armor and weakened from battle, fell into water barely 3 feet deep. The weight of his armor, designed to stop Turkish arrows and sword strikes, became an anchor dragging him down. He drowned in a muddy brook that a child could have waded across. The final humiliation for a dynasty that had ruled Hungary for 300 years. When Ottoman scouts found him, they cut off his head and brought it to Suleiman. The Sultan reportedly wept. Whether from genuine sorrow or political theater, nobody knows. But with Louis's death, the medieval kingdom of Hungary ceased to exist. At 3:05 on August 29th, Louis had managed to extract himself from the carnage of his final charge. His surviving bodyguards, fewer than 20 men, formed around him and fought their way north through Ottoman cavalry patrols. They rode hard, pushing exhausted horses beyond their limits. Ottoman arrows whistling past them. Louis's destrier had taken 3 arquebus balls during the charge, but was still moving, adrenaline overriding its wounds. For 2 hours, this desperate group of survivors dodged Sipahi patrols, zigzagging across the plains toward Buda, 60 miles distant. By 5 o'clock, they'd covered 5 miles, but the horses were dying beneath them. Louis's mount was bleeding from multiple wounds, its breathing labored, foam dripping from its mouth. The other survivors' horses were in similar condition. They needed water desperately, both for themselves and their animals. When they reached Selle Brook at 5:30, it must have seemed like salvation. Here's where the chronicles reveal something genuinely tragic. Louis's armor, a masterpiece of Gothic plate commissioned for his coronation, weighed 85 pounds. Every piece had been custom fitted: articulated gauntlets, a fluted breastplate, leg armor designed for mounted combat. It had cost 400 ducats, more than most Hungarian nobles earned in a decade. It had protected him through the battle, deflecting arrows and sword strikes. Now it became his executioner. The king's horse stepped into Selle Brook and immediately collapsed. The animal had been running on pure will. When it stopped to drink, its legs simply gave out. Louis, already exhausted from battle and flight, fell forward as his mount went down. He hit the water face first, the weight of his armor driving him into the muddy bottom. Think about that. 85 pounds of steel designed to save his life in combat became an anchor in 3 feet of water. His bodyguards later testified they tried to reach him within seconds. But Louis had fallen in the deepest part of the stream crossing, where the current had carved a channel. The mud was knee-deep. When they pulled him up 30 seconds later, water poured from his helmet. He was already unconscious. Attempts to revive him failed. The King of Hungary, who'd led his cavalry into impossible odds and fought with desperate courage, drowned in a stream that he could have walked across if he'd been wearing normal clothes. Let that sink in. Medieval military culture required kings to wear full armor as a symbol of warrior prowess. That requirement killed Louis more surely than any Ottoman weapon. His bodyguards, realizing they couldn't save him and Ottoman patrols were closing in, made the agonizing decision to abandon their king's body and flee. They stripped off his royal insignia so Ottomans wouldn't identify him immediately, hoping to buy time for some organized defense of Buda. On September 1st, Ottoman scouts searching the area found a body in elaborate armor half buried in mud. They dug it out, recognized the royal markings despite the bodyguards' attempts to hide them, and brought the corpse to Suleiman's camp. Ottoman chroniclers recorded that the Sultan ordered the body washed and properly displayed, then personally viewed the young king he just destroyed. Suleiman's reaction revealed the political calculation beneath any sorrow. He just eliminated the legitimate king of Hungary without executing him personally. No diplomatic complications, no martyred monarch, just a boy who drowned fleeing a battle. And Hungary, already militarily destroyed, now had no king, no army, no hope, and no time before Ottoman forces marched on Buda unopposed. The true catastrophe of Mohács revealed itself in the days after the battle. Hungary's entire military elite lay dead in the mud. Every major noble, every experienced commander, every professional soldier who might have organized resistance. Buda stood undefended. The great fortresses that ringed Hungary had skeleton garrisons. Suleiman's army marched north through a kingdom that had no ability to resist. Towns opened their gates without fighting. Castles surrendered after token resistance. By September 10th, Ottoman cavalry raided within sight of Vienna. The Hungarian nobility that survived Mohács fled to Austria or Poland, begging for help that came too late. Peasants abandoned their fields and fled to the mountains. And Suleiman's administrators began the methodical process of transforming Hungary from a Christian kingdom into an Ottoman province. 105 minutes had accomplished what generations of warfare couldn't. The casualty list read like a directory of Hungarian power. 28 magnates dead, representing nearly every major noble family in the kingdom. 7 bishops killed, including Archbishop Tomori, who'd commanded the army. 500 lesser nobles who formed the officer corps of Hungarian military. Think about that. The entire command structure of the kingdom, accumulated over centuries of aristocratic lineage, was wiped out in an afternoon. There was nobody left who knew how to organize defense, levy troops, coordinate fortresses, or negotiate with foreign powers. But here's what made the collapse genuinely catastrophic. Hungary's defensive system depended on a network of 43 major fortresses stretching from the Danube to the Carpathians. Before Mohács, each fortress maintained garrisons of 200 to 500 professional soldiers. After Mohács, those garrisons had been stripped to create the field army. The fortresses now held skeleton crews of 30 to 50 men, barely enough to man the walls, let alone defend against siege. Suleiman's army, still 60,000 strong after minimal casualties, could reduce any fortress in days. On September 3rd, the fortress of Peterwardine surrendered without firing a shot. Its garrison of 42 men faced Ottoman siege artillery and opened the gates rather than die pointlessly. September 5th, Sremska Mitrovica fell after token resistance lasting 6 hours. September 7th, Belgrade's outer fortifications were abandoned as defenders fled north. The cascade of surrenders happened so fast that Ottoman quartermasters struggled to garrison the captured fortresses. The speed of collapse defied military logic. Fortresses that should have held for months were falling in hours. But the defenders understood mathematical reality. No relief force was coming. The Hungarian field army was dead. Every noble who might have raised reinforcements lay in the mud at Mohács. Holding a fortress meant dying slowly through starvation rather than quickly through assault. Let that sink in. The defensive infrastructure of an entire kingdom collapsed because Mohács had killed everyone who could organize relief efforts. By September 8th, Ottoman cavalry patrols reached within 15 miles of Buda. The capital, which should have been Hungary's final defensive bastion, held fewer than 1,000 soldiers. Queen Mary, Louis's widow, fled with the crown jewels on September 9th, abandoning the city to its fate. The great noble families followed, taking what portable wealth they could carry. Peasants watching their rulers flee understood that no protection was coming. 500,000 people began migrating north toward Austrian territory or east toward Transylvania, abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. The economic devastation was immediate. Hungary's tax revenue for 1526 would total perhaps 30% of normal collection. Half the kingdom's agricultural land lay abandoned, crops rotting in fields. The silver mines that funded the treasury stood idle, miners having fled or been conscripted into the doomed army. Hungary's annual revenue of 200,000 ducats would drop to 60,000 within 6 months. Without money, there could be no army. Without an army, there could be no resistance. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. Suleiman didn't need to conquer Hungary through prolonged siege warfare. The kingdom was simply ceasing to exist through administrative collapse. Tax collectors found nobody to tax. Military recruiters found no nobles to commission troops. Civil administrators fled their posts. The machinery of government ground to a halt. And marching north at 15 miles per day, Suleiman's army approached Buda, where the crown jewels, royal treasury, and 5 centuries of Hungarian sovereignty waited for new management. Mohács didn't just destroy Hungary, it transformed the entire strategic balance of Europe. For the next 150 years, Ottoman armies would campaign in Central Europe almost annually. Vienna would endure 2 major sieges. The Habsburg Empire would spend half its resources defending against Turkish invasion. Poland would fight continuous border wars. But here's what military historians recognize as Mohács' true legacy. It marked the death of medieval warfare and the birth of modern military systems. The lesson was brutally clear. Discipline beat courage. Firepower beat armor. Combined arms tactics beat single-weapon dominance. Training beat tradition. Every European power that wanted to survive had to transform their militaries from feudal levies into professional standing armies, had to abandon knightly cavalry for pike and shot formations, had to build artillery trains that could match Ottoman firepower. Mohács killed the medieval military system and forced Europe into modernity, not through gradual evolution, but through catastrophic defeat. The numbers tell the story of panic-driven transformation. In 1527, the year after Mohács, Habsburg Austria increased its military budget by 240%. Emperor Charles V authorized the creation of permanent infantry regiments trained in arquebus and pike tactics. The imperial army that had fielded 12,000 men in 1526 expanded to 35,000 by 1530. Think about that. One battle scared Europe into tripling its military establishment within 4 years. But here's what the transformation really cost. Creating professional standing armies meant abandoning the feudal levy system that had defined European warfare for 8 centuries. Knights who'd held land in exchange for military service became obsolete. The new armies required full-time soldiers who drilled constantly in coordinated formations. Austria alone spent 400,000 ducats annually maintaining its new military, compared to 80,000 before Mohács. The economic burden was crushing. But the alternative was Ottoman conquest. The tactical innovations spread like wildfire through military treatises and drill manuals. Spanish commanders in Italy studied Ottoman tactics and developed the tercio formation, combining pikemen and arquebusiers in disciplined squares. French military theorists wrote extensively about coordinated artillery deployment. German principalities hired Italian engineers to modernize their fortifications against siege artillery. Every European power that wanted to survive reverse-engineered Ottoman military doctrine. Let that sink in. Christian Europe, which had viewed Ottomans as barbaric infidels, spent the next 50 years copying their military systems because Mohács proved those systems worked. The strategic geography of Europe fundamentally changed. Before Mohács, the Kingdom of Hungary served as Christendom's shield, absorbing Ottoman pressure and keeping Turkish armies far from Central European heartlands. After Mohács, that shield was gone. Vienna, the Habsburg capital, sat just 90 miles from Ottoman-controlled territory. In 1529, Suleiman besieged Vienna with 120,000 men. The city held, barely, but only because Charles V had spent 3 years building modern fortifications and training professional garrison troops. Poland faced continuous raiding along its southern border. Between 1526 and 1570, Polish forces fought 53 separate engagements with Ottoman armies or Crimean Tatar allies. The Commonwealth maintained permanent frontier armies of 15,000 men, a financial burden that consumed 40% of royal revenue. The Venetian Republic, watching Ottoman expansion, fortified Cyprus and Crete with modern star fortresses designed to resist siege artillery. The engineering projects cost 2 million ducats over 20 years. But here's the cruel irony. All this military modernization, all these professional armies and artillery trains and star fortresses were reactions to defeat. Europe transformed its military systems not through innovation, but through terror of what Mohács demonstrated was possible. And the transformation would take 150 years, during which time Ottoman armies would campaign annually in Central Europe, winning far more often than they lost. Until European military technology finally caught up at Vienna in 1683. But that final victory lay 157 years in the future. The immediate legacy of Mohács was simple. Medieval military systems were dead, and the new systems that would replace them were written in Hungarian blood. Think about what Mohács teaches us about military history. 15,000 men died because their commanders refused to accept that warfare had changed. Hungarian nobles charged Ottoman guns carrying tactics that were obsolete, weapons that were outdated, and confidence that was suicidal. They believed in courage, honor, and the individual knight's prowess. The Ottomans believed in mathematics, discipline, and coordinated firepower. 105 minutes proved which belief system controlled the future. But here's the deeper lesson that echoes through every military revolution. The side that recognizes change first wins. and the side that clings to tradition dies. The Hungarian cavalry at Mohács were among the finest warriors in Christendom. They were brave, skilled, magnificently equipped, and none of it mattered. They charged into a battle where those qualities were irrelevant, where artillery and muskets decided outcomes before swords could even be drawn. King Louis died in 3 feet of water, weighted down by armor that couldn't protect him from the new kind of warfare. His kingdom died with him, and Central Europe would bear the scars for centuries. The mathematics of obsolescence are brutal. A Hungarian knight represented 15 years of training from age 7, cost 200 ducats for armor, another 100 for his warhorse, decades of noble lineage and military tradition. A Janissary represented 15 years of training too, but his arquebus cost 12 ducats and could kill that 200-ducat knight from 40 yards away. The return on investment was catastrophic for medieval warfare. One gunpowder soldier with 6 months of musket drill could negate one aristocrat's lifetime of martial training. Let that sink in. The entire social structure of medieval Europe, where military prowess justified aristocratic privilege, collapsed when peasants with guns proved more effective than nobles with swords. The speed differential tells the story. Hungarian cavalry charges required years of coordination training. Each knight needed to understand his position in the formation, time his acceleration, maintain cohesion at full gallop. The Ottomans just needed their Janissaries to stand in line and fire on command. A formation that took years to perfect was defeated by a tactic that could be taught in weeks. Modern warfare had democratized killing, making it available to anyone who could load and aim a matchlock. But here's what makes Mohács genuinely haunting. Every Hungarian commander had access to the same intelligence Suleiman possessed. They knew about Janissary firepower. They'd received reports about Ottoman artillery. Baron Bathory had literally begged them to adapt tactics. And they refused because accepting that knights were obsolete meant accepting that their entire worldview was wrong. Think about that. They chose death over admitting their military tradition had become suicide. The casualty statistics reveal the cost of that choice. 15,000 Hungarian dead in 105 minutes equals 143 men killed every 60 seconds. The Ottoman guns and muskets created a kill rate that medieval warfare had never approached. The Battle of Crécy in 1346, considered catastrophically bloody, saw 8,000 dead in 9 hours, 17 per minute. Mohács killed men 8 times faster. Industrial-scale slaughter had arrived, and medieval military culture had no answer except dying with honor. Here's the cruel mathematics that should terrify anyone studying military history. The Hungarian investment in their cavalry arm, 1.5 million ducats over generations, was destroyed in less time than it takes to watch a modern movie. The Ottoman military system that destroyed them, built over 2 centuries of continuous evolution and adaptation, proved that institutional learning beats individual excellence every time. And Louis himself embodied the tragedy perfectly. 20 years old, no military experience, forced to make strategic decisions about technologies and tactics he didn't understand. He chose battle because 5 centuries of tradition said kings must be warriors. That tradition killed him in 3 feet of water, drowning under armor that represented everything medieval warfare believed about protection and status. The symbolism is almost too perfect. Medieval military culture literally weighted him down until he drowned. The Kingdom of Hungary that had stood for 500 years ended in one afternoon because its commanders refused to accept that the rules had changed. Mohács wasn't just a battle. It was a verdict on any military system that values tradition over adaptation, honor over effectiveness, aristocratic courage over mathematical reality. And that verdict echoes through every military revolution since. Adapt or die, because the future belongs to whoever recognizes change first.